So good evening. I invite everybody to please take a seat so we can begin. As you know, I like to begin not on Jewish time, but on time. So this is the third lecture in 4 series. We've had Dr. Bert Visotsky, Dr. Benjamin Gampel. Tonight we have Dr. David Fishman. I met Dr. Fishman when I was in college, when he was my modern Jewish history professor. And then again, when I was in rabbinical school, I took a class called Preaching in Ashkenazic Jewry. It was a seminar of about 5 or 6 people. We met in this very small room right outside of the Women's League Seminary Synagogue, and we analyzed how rabbis and preachers and teachers have used sermons for hundreds of years in Ashkenazi Jewry, way before rabbis of today started preaching. But then I really had the pleasure of getting to know Dr. Fishman, not as Dr. Fishman, but as David, when his son Elia and my son Jared were in first grade together at Solomon Schechter, and we lived on the Upper West Side, and we were able to spend numerous Shabbatot together and rekindle getting to know each other outside of that student-professor relationship, but really as our families got to know each other. And it's been wonderful to see how his work has flourished in the world of scholarship. I know that our very own Charlie Rose has taken classes with Dr. Fishman and has spent time learning with him. And in many ways, modern Jewish history, and then certainly American Jewish history, will feel the most familiar because it encapsulates a lot of our own narratives. But I know that tonight we'll continue to learn so much more. Everybody should have received a map when they walked in. One thing I want to make sure to announce, and we'll have these on the table outside, Dr. Fishman wrote a book this year called The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis. This is a nonfiction book that reads like fiction. It was written up in the Wall Street Journal, and it just won the National Jewish Book Award. So we are really excited to have an award-winning author. I told him to bring his books to sell. He didn't, but he should have, because I know this crowd would have bought them. But go on Amazon or Barnes & Noble and purchase them. It's a story of individuals who went back and were able to find materials that had been hidden during the war, and we all need to read it to learn more. I hope that tonight you learn what happened after we were expelled. Remember, that's where the story left off, 1492. And now here we somehow need to bring ourselves to the 21st century, where we've had the greatest success of Jewish life and in some ways the greatest tragedies of Jewish life. So that's really the story of modern Jewish history, but I leave it to Dr. Fishman to fill in the details.
Thank you, Rachel. It is a pleasure to be back with you. This kind of relationship that has all these twists and turns, you know. But it's always great when your former student just becomes a friend and a colleague. That's a good feeling. And thank you for having me. Thank you for this extraordinary project, you know, of all of Jewish history in 4 classes. For me, all of modern Jewish history, while standing on one foot, right, as Hillel would have said, and it's a challenge. You know, we get to specialize. I've been spending my time talking all across the country about my book, which is really about one little group of people during and after the Holocaust. So you've brought me back to reality, to the big picture. I'm going to focus overwhelmingly on Europe and to some extent on Israel. I'm leaving America to my colleague. Let me just remind you that on the eve of World War II, and for all of modern Jewish history until World War II, Jews were overwhelmingly a European people. That is, even in 1939, there were 10 million Jews in Europe, there were 4.5 million Jews in America, and there were 1.5 million Jews everywhere else. So I think the focus on Europe, but my problem is, of course, even looking, and this is a map I gave you of Europe, but it's a map of Europe on the eve of World War I. Sorry about that. In other words, if you're going to look for, you're not going to find a country called Poland on this map because there was no independent Poland until after World War I. Poland was mainly under Russia, and parts of it were under Austria-Hungary. In a lot of other smaller countries in Eastern Europe you won't find here. There is no Czechoslovakia or Czech Republic, et cetera, et cetera. My problem is, and I hope Gampel will forgive me, even though my period is shorter than his, it's much more complicated. Because you have a lot of different countries, you have Ashkenazim and Sephardim, and I'm going to try to let me give you the scheme, and then I'll go into the details. And that's the only reason why I wanted the board was for this moment. I'm going to break it down into, modern Jewish history has 4 periods. 4 periods. I'll take it from 1492, when Professor Gampel finished it off, and go to about 1750. That's called the early modern period, and I'm not going to have a lot to say about it. We just threw away 250 years. I'll explain why in a minute. Then you've got from 1750 till about, let's say, 1880. And that is, I want to explain, the period of Jews integrating into the majority society. It's the period of emancipation, acculturation, assimilation. I'll explain all those words, but I get the main thing I want you to know is that's 130 years of Jews moving away from the margins of European society into the mainstream. Third period, this is my overall structure for you, about 1880 until, let's say, 1945, and that is the reversal of integration. That is the rise of modern anti-Semitism, pogroms, and more generally culminating, of course, in the Holocaust. In other words, Jews are re-marginalized. They're no longer part of the mainstream of society. They're vilified. And there'll be a parting of the ways between Jews and Europe. In other words, really European Jewish history comes to almost an end, or certainly Europe as the center of Jewish life comes to an end. And then the fourth period is the period you could say we live in, the period of Jewish sovereignty, of having a Jewish state, from 1948 till today. So if you'll keep that scheme in mind, let me now go back. And let me tell you something that probably Gampel talked about, but I talk about more than he does. Before modern times, Jews were not just a religious group. Before modern times, Jews were a distinct legal category, a distinct social and even political entity. Let me explain that. First of all, if you were born Jewish, there were all kinds of restrictions on where you could live, what you could do for a living, and there were all kinds of special obligations because you're Jewish. Special taxes of all kinds, and there's no way to avoid them. Jews had to, that's simply a fact of life. Moreover, what matters to me is your life was very much circumscribed or limited to the Jewish community in many ways. What do I mean by that? The Jewish community had real governmental powers before modern times. The Jewish community could tax its members. It did tax its members. In fact, the Jewish community organization, the Kahal, raised taxes for the government, for the state. You didn't pay money to the government. You paid your taxes to the Jewish community. And it wasn't a donation. It was a tax. And the Jewish community had the power to punish its members. Jewish communities had their own prisons. They could fine, they could excommunicate, and if you didn't pay those taxes to the Jewish community, you would be punished. And the community was authorized by the state to punish its members for whatever infractions and offenses. So the point I'm trying to get to is before, especially among Ashkenazic Jews, before we hit 1750, Jews lived largely in a Jewish world. They're on the margins of European society. I'll give you an example. In the 1600s and in the early 1700s, very few Jews went to a university. There are many European universities in the 1600s and 1700s. Jews don't go. It's not even that they're excluded. Some places exclude, others don't. But Jews don't even know the language to take a university course in German or in Italian. Until pre-modern times, Jews live largely in their own world. And that's why I'm jumping ahead to 1750. It's in 1750, around 1750, these things don't happen overnight, that things start to change. And Jews enter the mainstream of life. This has to do with the ideas of the Enlightenment that affect both Jews and Europeans. And let me start with Europeans, I guess. Europeans start to say things like, the Enlightenment believes in the unity of humankind, in basic, a commonality of all human beings. The French Enlightenment, the German Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment starts changing the attitude towards the Jews. The Jews are not damned. The Jews are not cursed. They are not all Christ killers. In fact, they are more or less like anybody else. And if they are worse than others, the Enlightenment says, it's because of historical factors, which can change. In other words, if the Jews are not good in certain ways, they are certainly capable of changing. And so that Enlightenment thinkers start to say things like, the Jew is more human being than Jew, which is a breakthrough, that idea. Or, if you want the Jews to love their homeland, give them a homeland, which means if Jews don't love the country where they live, it's because these countries have been persecuting them. If we stop persecuting the Jews, they will love their country. So Europeans change their attitude towards, of course not all, but the articulate elite is changing its attitude towards Jews. And Jews are changing their attitude towards the surrounding majority culture. This is represented by the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment movement, Moses Mendelssohn. Jews learn the language of the land, the literature and history of the land, and start to they change their dress. There's basically an assumption here on both sides, a kind of rapprochement. And Jews think if we get closer to the majority culture, change our language, our dress, show our interest in the majority society and culture. If we change, then society will continue to change in its attitude towards us. This culminates in the thing we call emancipation. Emancipation, that's a fancy word, and I gave you a map that's about the emancipation of European Jewry. Emancipation, and that the word is very loaded, what it really means is the granting to Jews of equal citizenship in the state. No more special restrictions on Jews where they can live or what they can do for a living. No more special taxes that only Jews have to pay. Jews are now citizens like anybody else with the same rights and same obligations as anybody else. Of course, that did mean abolishing the old type of Jewish community, which had all those powers to tax, to punish. All right, that's the deal. Jews are now subordinate to the state. They're not subordinate to the Jewish community. And Jews were so excited by that prospect of becoming equal citizens, it was a new experience then, that they called that process emancipation, right? Which is almost a term we use in American history to talk about slavery and the emancipation of the slaves, the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, Jews use that term to describe from slavery to freedom. That is, their liberation is that they are no longer legally separate, they are now equal citizens. Now, as you see from the map, that didn't happen everywhere at the same time. The first country where Jews became equal citizens under the law was France, as part of the French Revolution. And 1790, actually, I don't know why they put, I'll say it's 1790, not 1789. And then German Jewry, which was a larger Jewry than French Jewry, has a very complicated history. It's a seesaw history. They get emancipated, it gets taken away. They get emancipated, it gets taken away. And the final emancipation of all of German Jewry is only in 80 years after France, in 1871. Russian Jewry, the largest Jewry in Europe, had to wait even much longer than that. The Jews of Russia are a separate legal category and with special disabilities down until 1917, when the Russian Revolution takes place. So a big part of modern Jewish history is this process of emancipation, that is, Jews becoming equal citizens under the law, and integrating into the mainstream in terms of culture, in terms of occupations and things like that. Now, because Germany had a very tortured history of emancipation, let me give you the details. German Jews became equal citizens in 1812, but then it was taken away in 1815. So from 1815, for the next decades, Jews are second-class citizens. Then they're emancipated in 1848, in the revolutions of 1848, but when those revolutions fail in 1849, it's taken away. And then they have to wait several more decades until 1871. Because it's a tortured history, Jews are always struggling to show that they can and should be, they can be equals, and they should be accepted by the majority of German society. And they're trying to show that they deserve equal rights. And the big thing that happens in German Jewry is the rise of the modern religious denominations. All the modern religious denominations in Jewry originate in Germany. That is, Reform Judaism, Neo-Orthodox or Modern Orthodox Judaism, and Conservative Judaism all come from Germany in the 19th century because they're all facing the same question. That is, they want, on the one hand, to adapt Judaism so that it is closer to the surrounding majority culture, up to a limit, up to a point, and they all disagree on the limit. But they all want to adapt Judaism to show that it is not antithetical to being a full-fledged member of the society. You can be a Jew and be a German at the same time. Now, they are all saying that. All the religious denominations. They disagree on how much do you have to change Judaism so that it is, in harmony with being a German. But by the way, they all agree Jews are first and foremost a religion. In other words, especially Reform, which is the growing and dominant religious denomination in Germany in the 19th century. That is, Orthodoxy is declining. Conservative Judaism is a small, important, but small trend. It's really Reform is the main game in town in 19th century Germany. And Reform is very clear on these things. Jews are only a religion. We are Germans of the religion of Moses, of the Mosaic persuasion. At that time, they eliminate all the prayers in the prayer book that refer to Zion and Jerusalem. Because if you pray to Zion and Jerusalem, that makes you sound like you're a nation. You want to have a Jewish kingdom. And you want to be somewhere else. Well, you're not a good German if you want to live somewhere else under your own king. They want to take out all these national components of Judaism. Reform, again, this is all about drawing Judaism closer to the majority culture. So that things like just the style of prayer, the organ, prayer in the German language. Last thing I'll say about this topic is even the Orthodox in Germany are adapting Judaism. First of all, even the Orthodox in Germany embrace emancipation. That is, they say, we want to be full-fledged members of German society. They embrace secular education. Jews should and are more and more Orthodox Jews speaking German, not Yiddish. They're going to universities, and the Orthodox rabbis are going to university. In other words, even they, the big thing is, they don't want to be totally separate. They don't want to be like in the Middle Ages. Even in Germany, even the Orthodox rabbis want to be part of the general society, but fully maintain halakha, fully maintain all the requirements of Jewish law. But even when you look closer, the Orthodox in Germany, they are adding a choir to the service. Yes, an all-male choir, an all-Jewish choir, not a cantor. The rabbi wears these formal robes, just like Reform rabbis and just like Protestant ministers. In other words, even the Orthodox make changes in all kinds of areas. So to wrap up this second period, I've skipped the first period, the early modern period, before 1750. By 1870s, 1880s, you've had a relatively successful integration of Jews into European society. Jews know the languages and cultures of the land they live in. They, by and large, don't know Hebrew anymore. I'm talking about in Western and Central Europe, in France and Germany especially. They are going to university. They are entering the professions, that is, that many of them becoming doctors and other professions. They're middle class. I'm not going to say it's totally successful, but by and large, and the crowning event in Germany, of course, is the full-fledged emancipation of German Jews in 1871. I'm going to end that second period right there. Then, beginning in the 1870s, I'm moving on to his third of four periods, you get a backlash. The backlash begins in Germany, and it will reach a higher point in Russia, and then culminate again in Germany. The backlash in Germany, beginning in the 1870s, is the rise of modern anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism which says that all the ills of society are to be blamed on the Jews. If there is economic crisis, it's because of the Jews. If culture is declining, it's because of the Jews. If there are political or military problems, it's because of the Jews. This new, let me stress a few things about it. In other words, this is a reaction to the full-fledged emancipation of German Jewry. Jews have no more restrictions, they're entering all spheres of life, and now you get the backlash, which says the Jews are taking over and they're ruining our country. The term is new, anti-Semitism. The term was coined in Germany in the 1870s. It was not coined by Jews. It was coined by the people who espoused these ideas, who called themselves anti-Semites. They called themselves anti-Semites because they believed Jews were a distinct race, namely Semites. And there are no other Semites in Europe at this time, right? There are no Muslims. So the Jews were the only Semites in Europe at this time. And their point was, the evil of the Jews is not their religion. As in fact, even if a Jew converts to Christianity, he's still a Jew in their eyes. Because the problem is racial. That is, the Jews have biologically inherent negative traits that can never go away. Even after you, it's not that their religion teaches them evil things. Yes, their religion is a symptom, not a cause. The cause is they themselves, their racial characteristics. And the program of anti-Semites, because they created an organization in the 1870s in Germany called the League of Anti-Semites, is to roll back emancipation. In other words, to get back to the good old Middle Ages, when Jews were segregated, where Jews were separate. They want to pass laws like that Jews can't be teachers in public schools. They want to, all kinds of other restrictions to get us back to the state of Jewish separateness. Jews should not be in cultural institutions. That's their vision. Now you can say, and probably should say, that in the 1870s they're a minority. And in fact, Jews remain emancipated in Germany until the rise of Hitler in 1933. They are a minority. They're even, you could say, a small minority, but anti-Semitism has entered the realm of German politics from the 1870s, and certain parties will embrace, political parties will embrace anti-Semitic ideas, and sometimes even big parties will rather opportunistically support anti-Semitism. Okay. We're getting the beginnings of a kind of exclusionary German nationalism. It says Jews are not Germans. They can't be Germans. Because they are Semites, they can't be Germans. In Russia, the new anti-Semitism is not as explicitly racial. The theory is not as developed. On the other hand, in Russia, beginning in the 1880s, the anti-Semitism is more overtly violent. That is, you get pogroms. The first wave of pogroms in Russia is in 1881, 1882. Pogroms were not commonplace in Russia until 1881, 1882. You'll have another big wave of pogroms between 1903 and 1906. And I just want to point out that those pogroms were called, by those who perpetrated them, patriotic pogroms. Patriotic, in other words, if you love the Tsar and you love this country with its Russian Orthodox Church, you love Russian tradition, then you must beat the Jews, because the Jews are the greatest threat and danger to the Russia we know and love. Right? The slogan was, again, it's, in that sense, it's similar. Whatever the danger to society is the Jewish nemesis, the Jewish peril. Their slogan was, beat the Jews and save Russia. And it's in this period, the early 20th century, where Tsarist Russia becomes a clearly anti-Semitic state. The government is embracing very new, even worse anti-Semitic policies than before. Quotas on Jews in universities, 3%. 3% quotas on Jews in universities. All kinds of restrictions on where Jews can live. And probably the culminating event is the trial of Mendel Bayless, a blood libel trial, really pushed by the government to accuse a Jew in Kiev of murdering a Christian child, to use that child's bloods for matzah. That is a trial held in 1911. In the 20th century, we have in Russia a blood libel trial, which is not a trial against one person. It's really a trial against all Jews and Judaism. So I've described the backlash. Jews are getting more and more into the mainstream, and the backlash is this modern anti-Semitism. And now the backlash to the backlash. The backlash to the backlash is the rise of Jewish nationalism. If you want, Jews saying, we don't want to be in Europe anymore. We, in this continent or in this country where we are hated. We don't believe anymore in emancipation as a goal. Even if we'll be on paper equal citizens, we'll never be really accepted by our neighbors. And of course it's a rise of Jewish nationalism, and of course the form of Jewish nationalism we know best is Zionism. So that the first manifesto of modern Zionism, even before Theodor Herzl, is by Leon Pinsker, a doctor in Odessa, Russia, and he wrote this pamphlet in 1882, and he calls it auto-emancipation. Auto-emancipation means we don't want anybody to emancipate us. We don't believe in your European emancipations. We will emancipate ourselves by creating our own homeland, right? Where that's called auto-emancipation. We will create our own state, our own homeland, our own territory. So this is the backlash to the backlash, which is if you want, I'll put it this way: Europe is beginning to reject the Jews, and the Jews are beginning to reject Europe. We want our national homeland outside of Europe, in our own territory, our own historic homeland, the land of Israel. Let me stress one thing about this. Zionism, and there are other forms of Jewish nationalism, but Zionism was the easiest example, conceives of Jews as a people, not as a religion, right? It's a total rejection. In other words, what really unites Jews is not worshiping of God. It's about a common land that they're attached to, the land of Israel, a common language, just like any other nation. What is a people? A people, whether you're talking about Frenchmen or Germans or Russians, they have a land and a state. They have a language. They have a history. They have a culture. That's what a people is, or what a nation is. Well, that's what the Jews are, Zionism claims. We are united, bound together by our land, our language, our history, and our culture. It's true, our culture was in the past mainly religious, but that's the past. Most Zionists envision a future in which the role of religion will decline more and more. So what they most of them envision is a secular Jewish nation in its homeland. So that, for instance, Zionists read the Bible, love the Bible, but for them, the Bible is not the divine word of God. It's not revealed. The Bible for them is, first of all, the chronicle of our ancient history when Jews had a kingdom in their own homeland, in the land of Israel. So it's very important for that it records David and Solomon and all the following kings. And it's the great Jewish literary classic in Hebrew. So they do it, very much revere the Bible, but it's not in a religious way. It's now in a secular, national way. And, of course, Herzl comes after Pinsker, founds the World Zionist Organization in 1897. You will have different waves of Aliyah. Of course, the most, extreme expression of this new conception of what a Jew is will be among socialist Zionists who explicitly say we want to create a new kind of Jew. The diaspora Jew, the exilic Jew, is a negative for us. The diaspora Jew was weak. He was submissive. He was backward, ignorant. The new Jew that we will create in the land of Israel will be strong, will be courageous, will be modern and secular. So that image of what we call the negation of a diaspora, we are going to create a new Jew in the Jewish homeland, is something that the socialist Zionists really push for. Of course, as part of this divorce with Europe, and I'm talking with one form of the divorce from Europe that's emerging here, the backlash to the backlash, right? Anti-Semitism, and then Jews saying, you know what, I've had enough of this. One form is Zionism. The other form, we know well, is the Great Migration to America. Between 1881 and 1924, that's a 43-year period. In those 43 years, 1881, 1924, 2.5 million Jews left Eastern Europe for the United States. Right? So that is another way in which Jews reject the prospect of emancipation in Europe by leaving to the United States. I want to go mention, there's a third option that Russian Jews have. There's Zionism, there's emigration to America. The third option is socialism and revolution. If this place is evil, pogroms, other things, we need to change this place in a very radical and, if necessary, violent way. And that means we have to topple the Tsar, we have to have a revolution. And that's the third stream that emerges here, which is not a rejection of Europe, but a rejection of the status quo. And the main Jewish organization that embraces that is called the Bund, and they're the Jewish Socialist Party in Russia. And they're both socialists, and I will say they're also Jewish nationalists of a type. That is, they don't envision Jews assimilating. They want Jews to have their own language, Yiddish, and to have their own communities, but of secular communities. They're also not religious. They envision a secular Jewish people in Russia in the Yiddish language. That's the other version of Jewish nationalism. Okay, I'm coming down the home stretch. I'll just mention one other big historical event, and big year. We don't give it credit for what a big year it is. 1917 is a big year in Jewish history because two visions look like they are winning, or that they have great hope. Their hopes are lifted. Obviously, you all know the Zionist vision is lifted in 1917 when the Balfour Declaration is issued. That is, the British announced they will support the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine. I know in 1917 it's just a declaration, but literally a couple months later, the British are in Palestine. It's the middle of World War I. So they may issue this declaration in November. By January, 2 months later, the British are in, under General Allenby, are already in Palestine, and they will stay there. And their status there will be recognized by international law in 1920, when you get the League of Nations mandate for Palestine. That is, the League of Nations designates Britain as the temporary ruling power in Palestine in order to create a Jewish national home there. So 1917 is a big moment, the big really turning point as far as, also as far as Jewish opinion. In other words, a lot of Jews were not Zionists. Most Jews were not Zionists. It's a gradual process in which Jews became more and more Zionistic. And 1917, when Balfour issues that declaration, is a moment when a lot of Jewish public opinion shifts towards Zionism. The other hope that is raised in 1917 is the hope of a new, renewed Russia, because there's a revolution in Russia in 1917, and the Soviet Union will be founded. I want to stress that in the early decade, that there's a hope for equality, there's a hope also for, for emancipation, and also for free Yiddish culture. I want to stress that in the first decades of the Soviet Union, 1920s, 1930s, the Soviet Union was not an anti-Semitic state. It will eventually become one, but it's, in fact, it's the one state in Europe that is actively combating anti-Semitism in the 20s and early 30s. There were pogroms in Russia right around the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917. And the one force that puts down pogroms, that punishes pogromists, is the Red Army, the Soviet Army. Jews in the early decades of the Soviet Union rise to positions of power. A lot of Lenin's cabinet, the first early Soviet cabinets, are made up of Jews. Yes, assimilated Jews, but nonetheless everybody knows they're Jews, most famous being Leon Trotsky. But there were many, many others. Just about most of Lenin's canon. That was a new phenomenon in Russia, that Jews could become ministers, could rise to positions of power. What I'm trying to stress is, I'm also trying to alert you, why a lot of American Jews looked to the Soviet Union in the 1920s, and especially 1930s, when Hitler comes to power. Soviet Union was actually the only state in Europe, at least in the 1920s, that overtly punished people for anti-Semitism. Of course, that's going to change after World War II. And I'm just going to wrap up. That hope, we talk about two hopes arising in 1917. One of those hopes will continue to be a hope and will be, in fact, realized. That's the Zionist hope. The other hope, the Soviet hope, will prove false, especially after World War II, when the Soviet Union will become an explicitly anti-Semitic state that discriminates against Jews in all kinds of spheres, vilifies Judaism more than it vilifies other religions, vilifies Zionism as this diabolical force for evil in the world. I will remind you that the United Nations resolution equating Zionism with racism in 1975 was sponsored and led by the Soviet Union, which had the greatest anti-Zionist, really used Zionism to create anew the image of a world Jewish conspiracy. So don't get me wrong, I'm not a pinko, I'm not a communist. But the Soviet Union of the 20s and 30s is different, and then the Soviet Union from the 1940s on is different yet again. Of course, that hope, once the gates are opened, you'll have a significant emigration of Jews from the Soviet Union, mainly to Israel, in the 70s and even more so in the late 1980s and 1990s. All right, I will mention the Holocaust. Again, for me, in this sort of scheme I've created for you, the Holocaust is the culmination of this third period or phase. It's the culmination of Europe, turning against the Jews. A process that began in the 1870s and 1880s, and it culminates with the rise of Hitler and then the Holocaust itself, which of course wipes out Europe as a center of Jewish life. In other words, the European era, which is about 1,000 years, ends with the Holocaust. So now let's go back to the second hope, and this is sort of my last topic. I said there were two hopes that were raised in 1970. That is, of course, the hope of a Jewish homeland in Israel. The British rule for 30 years. It's a complicated and troubled relationship, but the bottom line is, in that period of British rule, the Yishuv grew from an insignificant, the Jewish community in Palestine, in the land of Israel, grew from something insignificant to something quite significant. In other words, in 1917, when the British came in, there were about 60,000 Jews in the land of Israel. That's not a lot compared to world Jewry. By 1948, when the British left, there were 700,000 Jews in the land of Israel, and that's already quite a significant Jewish community. One of the largest Jewish communities outside America was already in 1948, the land of Israel. Yes, the founding of the State of Israel, just to say what you've all heard and know, but it has to be said, yes, is a consequence of Holocaust guilt. That is, that vote in the United Nations definitely was affected by the revelations of the magnitude of the Holocaust. It was also happened to be possible, that vote, because both the East and the West supported the creation of Israel. That is, the United States voted yes, and the Soviet Union voted yes. And that meant the Soviet satellite states voted yes, countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, and American allies voted yes. So it's a fortunate circumstance that in the midst of the Cold War, East and West at that one moment agreed on the creation of a Jewish state. What do we, of course, this is a topic for a whole lecture. What are we to make of, what's our evaluation of Israel? But of course, it's a monumental event, but let me just point out a few things that we often forget. The creation of Israel solved the Jewish refugee problem once and for all. In other words, in the late 1930s, there were these tragic cases of Jews trying to leave Germany and literally having nowhere to go. The ships, the St. Louis and others, there were many more than just that ship. There was no one was willing to receive them. And again, after World War II, the displaced persons, and there's hundreds of thousands of Jewish DPs in camps with nowhere to go. Since 1948, this problem does not exist. Jews have a place to go. Wherever they are in trouble, there is at least one place that will accept them, and that is the Jewish state of Israel. Israel has also secured the future of the Hebrew language as a living language. It's definitely secured the future of a secular Jewish peoplehood. I think secular Israeli identity is viable. It's not going away. It's not in crisis. And I also think we have to realize in perspective what Israel has become. In the 1950s, Israel was a very small country, a poor country. It was a third world country. It had rationing, food rationing. It had a rather undeveloped economy, and it was surrounded by enemies. That's the 1950s. You jump forward 60 years, 70 years, and what are we talking about? We're talking about a very developed country, one of the most developed countries as far as economy that there is, a strong country militarily, and one that has made peace with at least two of its neighbors, that is Egypt and Jordan. So this country is in a different state than it was when it was founded. I happen to think that the nature of anti-Semitism has also changed thanks to the state of Israel, and let me explain to you what I mean. Before there was a Jewish state, a lot of anti-Semitism was about contempt for Jews. That is simply despising them, as if they are nothing. You could say anything and do anything to Jews with kind of abandon because they were insignificant. They had no power. And I think the creation of a Jewish state, there are still a lot of people who hate Jews. But no one has that after the state of Israel and its military ability. You don't see that kind of contempt and despising and kind of anti-Semitic abandon because the image of the Jew has changed in the world because of the existence of a sovereign Jewish state. I could go on. I guess I'll have a concluding thought. Maybe it's controversial. Of course, we all have to get used, the whole world has to get used to the idea of Jews in power. Everybody has to get used to that. In other words, the idea is that Jews don't have any power is very ingrained in everybody's thinking, because for 2,000 years, Jews didn't have much power. There are people who resent that Jews have power. And a lot of anti-Israel sentiment is fueled by that. Jews, they don't deserve, they can be victims, but they shouldn't have power. And I have to admit, I think that we Jews have not yet gotten used to the idea that we actually have a lot of power. We are not a small, weak state. We're not that vulnerable, actually. We're actually quite a strong, but we're not used to being strong. We were weak for 2,000 years. So we often continue to see ourselves as weak when we, in fact, are actually quite strong. So we have to adjust to the recognizing that that the state of Israel actually has a good deal of power. and needs to wield that power responsibly. The bottom line is the Jewish world today is so radically different from the Jewish world 250 years ago when I started, 1750 really. They're almost, unrecognizable one to the other. All the terms we use to talk about Jewish problems are products of the modern age. There was no word anti-Semitism. There was no word Zionism. There was no Orthodox conservative reform. In other words, there was no issue of assimilation. Only in modern times can Jews dissolve into a majority culture, because beforehand you were under the Jewish community, whether you liked it or not. So everything, the way we conceive of Jewish life, let alone know Israel, everything, the way we conceive of Jewish life, is a product of the modern era. And the modern era, as we have it now, is really about a Jewish world with two centers, Israel and America, and a European periphery. Well, that also, the geographic revolution is striking. If once upon a time Europe was the center, and there were small communities in the New World and in the land of Israel, now it's exactly the opposite. The future is all about America and Israel, and Europe will tag along, but it will never be a center again. Okay, that's my whirlwind tour. Thank you for listening.
Why is it that the Soviet Union did vote with the United States in that lucky coincidence at that time?
Okay. Should I take a couple more questions? All right. Or should I do those two first?
Why don't we do this? Why don't we take a few questions, and then if they're grouped, you can answer them.
Okay.
So those are two. Any other questions that we want to put on the table? And then Dr. Fishman and Michael.
Well, just to say thank you for the very comprehensive overview of this period of time. It was stunning. Specifically that period of time, I think Marty referred to this 1870, 1880 period. What were the legal restrictions on the Jews in Germany? And did they take, did the Germans review what was happening in the post-Civil War United States to the blacks in this country, restrictions on marriage that subsequently in the 1930s,
Right.
Nazis reviewed the civil rights of blacks in this country to make them Nuremberg laws?
Good question. Any other questions that we want to put on the table?
You can keep thinking. If you don't have one now, you'll...
You can ask it.
Yeah. Let me take these meanwhile. Let me explain about the 1870s. The rise of this kind of modern and organized anti-Semitism in Germany in the 1870s is a direct reaction to the full-fledged emancipation of German Jews in 1871. In other words, for the first time in a long time, there are no restrictions on what Jews can do in Germany in 1871. That means they can enter all walks of life and all professions, in theory, even be a minister. That is shocking to the most conservative elements of German society and threatening. They feel like the Jews are everywhere. Of course, the story of Jewish emancipation is actually very similar and parallel to the story of African Americans in this country. Again, once they're allowed into the mainstream of society, then of course the most conservative people think they're everywhere, and they're uppity, and all those things. So anyway, that's just simply a parallel. So that's the impetus. The emancipation of the German Jews is the impetus for the organization. And what's new here is not the feeling. What's new, some of the ideas are new, but what's really new is they get organized. They have leagues of anti-Semites. They have parties, running on anti-Semitism. So they're organized, not just a feeling, not just a public opinion, but they're a group. Now, as I stressed, they never form a government, not until Hitler. In other words, they're never in control, these anti-Semitic groups. They're an irritant in German life. There are no new restrictions. They don't win in this period. From 1871 until 1933, there are no legal restrictions on Jews in Germany. But as we know, as American Jews, legal restrictions isn't everything. An atmosphere, a climate where groups, extremist groups, can freely express these kind of ideas without a lot of pushback, right? That is tremendous. What's happening in our day as far as, right? So it's not only about the laws, it's about the climate that is changed by this kind of very active, vocal anti-Semitic groups. Nonetheless, I have to tell you the truth, most German Jews until 1933 were not Zionists. Most German Jews believed, until Hitler came to power, that this is a problem, an irritant, but with time it will be conquered. They still believe in emancipation and in progress. So that's the Germans' story of anti-Semitism. I don't know if I want to go into the Russian story. Is a very different story, and it's a very different dynamic. Did you want to hear? Did you ask about? You asked really about Germany, not about Russia. So I'll stick to Germany. What? Oh, Russia. I'll make it simple. The Tsar was assassinated in 1881. The Russian Tsar was by a group of revolutionaries. About 20 people involved in the plot. There was one Jewish woman out of the 20 people who assisted in the plot. She didn't lay the bomb. She wasn't, but she helped. What you got was rumors that the Jews killed the Tsar. And then you get a backlash with a wave of pogroms that the Jews killed the Tsar. And this kind of stereotype that the Jews are all revolutionaries, they're against our state, our king, our way of life, really takes hold, starting with this dynamic in 1881. Okay, 1948. Why did both East and West? It's a question actually about both, actually. You realize why the East is actually the easier part of the question to ask. The Soviets supported the establishment of the State of Israel then, in 47 and 48, because they wanted to get the British out. From there, this is Cold War politics, and from their perspective, the British have a foothold in the Middle East. And anything than a British, effectively, colony in the Middle East is better. They had hopes at that point in 47, 48, that maybe this new Jewish state would be friendly to the Soviets. Let me remind you, the dominant party was the Labor Party. These are socialists, most of them from Russia. They even had a common language. They could speak Russian with them. And so they had hopes, at the minimum, they'll get the British out. And if they're lucky, at the maximum, they'll have an ally in the Middle East. So that's why the Soviets supported the creation of a Jewish state. The Americans, it wasn't, because of the State Department, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that America would support a Jewish state. America was not actually, that's why I'm saying it's a question on both sides. America was not looking to complicate its relations with Britain, an ally in the Cold War. But I do think both, moral considerations and politics, swayed the Americans. So that's why I always see it as a very lucky, almost like a providential moment. Something that didn't have to happen, happened.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to that, and maybe also when Dr. Schwartz comes and she speaks about American Jewish history, this will come in. modern Jewish power, where we as Jews use relationships behind the scenes to have an impact on our own history?
My easy answer is ask Julie Schwartz next time. But I want to say, no, of course, Jews using connections behind the scenes is a long-standing tradition. I don't think that's new. And I don't know, I doubt that that's the only factor here. Let me point out the DP problem was a real crisis. In other words, you have several 100,000 Jews in these camps in Europe living under bad conditions with nowhere to go. And they are a living reminder of, the world's indifference during the Holocaust. They are, and how are you going to solve it? And by the way, the United States didn't want to let them all in. And so that's putting pressure on the United States. There's got to be some solution. And the Zionists are knocking down their door. And so there was a real-life crisis to resolve, which was the DP crisis. And from the Americans' perspective, the most sensible solution would be let them have their little Jewish state in Palestine.
Well, actually, a couple of weeks ago, Daniel Gordescott said that in December 47, the State Department actually proposed a re-vote in the UN for the partition of Palestine. And so that would go more towards, the rabbi says, was a personal connection of Truman and his Jewish buddy lobbying than the State Department worrying about displaced people.
Right. No, the State Department didn't worry. Okay, but I can't claim to be an expert in it. Really can't on American calculations. Yes. Oh, I didn't get to mention that one. Thank you. Right. Of course, in the litany of things landmarks of anti-Semitism in Tsarist Russia, I mentioned pogroms, I mentioned the Baylis case, the blood libel trial, but in between, the other great landmark, the other great contribution of Tsarist Russia to anti-Semitism is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which were a forgery produced by someone in the Russian elite, governing elite. Of course, it claims to be, as these records of secret meetings of Jewish leaders throughout the world who gather, to basically control the economy, the banks and politics. And this was translated and it's a very influential work. In other words, first of all, it gets translated into German, because this is written before World War I, right? It's around 1907. It's translated into German and has tremendous influence on the Nazis. Alfred Rosenberg, one of the great anti-Semites of Germany, and then a close assistant to Hitler, edited and translated the protocols into German. So it had a tremendous impact on the Nazis, this little booklet. And of course it lives on and on. In America, it had its own, quite prominent history. And to this day, it's read widely in the Arab world. So that's why I call it a contribution. In other words, this book, originally written in Tsarist Russia, has had a very long life and history and impact. And I have seen copies, when I go to Eastern Europe, as I do. I can see copies on the street, sold on the street in Kiev, or in Kiev it's open. In Moscow, I think it's possible, though that not as easy as in Kiev.
It's interesting that France was at the forefront historically.
That's right.
In terms of the Enlightenment and the emancipation. And my question is, going all the way through the aftermath of the Holocaust, can
I don't see Europe as monolithically anti-Semitic. Maybe I disagree with you there. You'd have to go country by country. Ironically today, there are different countries, but ask me what are the most friendly countries towards both Jews and towards Israel? I guess I'd put Germany and Great Britain. But most European countries on the surface try. That is, Macron of France went to Israel, meets Netanyahu, shakes his hand, the Italians. In other words, I don't see there being a crisis of anti-Semitism in Europe of major proportions. I have to tell you that. Anti-Israel sentiment is the topic to talk about.
Let me say another. The French Prime Minister may be a good handshaker.
Yeah.
My read is that the French Jews are under a tremendous amount of pressure.
Yes, but they're under pressure not from Frenchmen so much as from Muslims, right? The big problem of anti-Semitism in France today is by either immigrants or the children of immigrants, who are considered French citizens, of course. So that is a big problem. That is a Muslim-Jewish conflict or an Arab-Jewish conflict on the soil of France. But I have to tell you that the reaction of the French, from what I see, of the French government, of the previous French government, the Prime Minister Val gave an extraordinary speech in the French Parliament about the evil of anti-Semitism. So, you can never say we're doing enough, but the problem of the Arab immigrants in Europe is the main irritant on the ground. But I don't see that, indigenous Frenchmen are so anti-Semitic. Okay, great.
Going to France for over 30 years and studying there, unfortunately, I was exposed and I saw anti-Semitism from both the French and from the Muslim community. And it is so deeply inbred. The only thing that I can compare it to is how Southerners
Mm-hmm.
are raised. And there's a deep underlying racism that we grow up with that we don't even realize we're being taught.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing is happening in France, and it's been going on for centuries. And Napoleon, even though he did do the emancipation, he did everything possible to emancipate the Jews. The French never forgave him for that because there's always an element of the monarchy there, even to this day. And the Catholic Church is very much a part of that. When you're behind closed doors or when you're with certain members of the government, they will never publicly say, and I agree with you completely about Val's.
I thought Val's speech was extraordinary.
He's amazing. He's extraordinary.
Right.
He's very pro-Israel. He's very pro-Jewish. But other members of the government are not.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be very unwise for anyone going into there to think that they are pro-Israel or that they support the Jewish element there. There are thousands of people leaving France.
And of course.
And it's not just because of Muslims. It is because of people. Even 2 years ago, we had friends, an Alsatian butcher held a man. And they left as soon as he was released and he was okay, the family left within months. There are incidents, you probably know about 2,000 incidents a year of Jews being attacked and assaulted. It's not just Muslims.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm not going to, dispute. You seem to know the situation closer than I do. So I'll leave it at that. But I wouldn't think it would be fair to generalize, even from the obviously difficult situation in France, to generalize to all of Europe. You've got to go country by country, right?
Yeah.
Right.
White supremacists,
Right.
anti-Semitic, and whatever. So rumblings are beginning.
Of course. Of course, we have a because we're a minority, and we've always been a minority, we have a tendency to worry. I wouldn't say that that's unhealthy in our situation, to worry. But you can't lose your equilibrium. In our country, you can't compare the situation in our country yet, at least. Right.
So what I'd like to do is share one thing and then ask Dr. Fishman in conclusion to say a little bit about his book, because he humbly did not talk about it, but I do think we all know about the Holocaust, but he has a very specific angle that he did some studying on. So if you're willing to give some of it
Wow.
away by sharing sort of the
Well, thank you.
timelines. But thinking about this, many of you know that since the last, you can't hear me, sorry, Irving, thank you. Since the last lecture,
Since the last lecture, many of you know I got back from Italy. I was there for 3 days at a conference convened by Italy on anti-Semitism. And it was 50-plus countries sitting around a table, all affirming that, yes, anti-Semitism is a problem in Europe, and yes, they want to do something about it. Simultaneously, you have the foreign minister from Poland saying it, and then we know, of course, that the law comes out about... Oh, Poland was sitting there. Oh, yes. Yes, it was unbelievable because it was the week that it had just been announced that it was sort of on the docket. So I think what we need to do is just be vigilant to read the news and to understand what's going on and to be able to speak to those that we need to, but not to cut off relations. Because what I learned from that conference was, yes, there is anti-Semitism, but simultaneously I was invited as a rabbi to meet the Pope. So we are in power and we have access in ways that we didn't have before, and we need to understand what that means. Neither are perfect, but we need to think about what we should do with that. With that, I want us to conclude by hearing Dr. Fishman talk about his book.
First of all, let me agree with you, Rachel. In other words, today is not the 1930s, and today is not the 1920s. We have a kind of influence and ability to affect events that we did not have then. And, okay, again, that's our historical comparison, just to say. I don't even think France today is Poland in the or let alone Germany in the 1930s. My book is simply an inspiring story from the Holocaust. And that's a funny thing to say. It's in the Holocaust and after, but it's an inspiring story, which is how a group of Jews hid Jewish cultural treasures from the Nazis, buried them underground. It takes place in the city of Vilna in today Lithuania. And over a course of a year and a half, hid thousands of books, thousands of manuscripts, Torah scrolls, art, at great risk to their lives, past German guards. And then those ghetto inmates who survived came back and looked for it, dug it up. After about a year, realized they're in the Soviet Union. Vilnius is now, and that they have to rescue the materials again. And they smuggle a lot of it out of the Soviet Union. And it ends up in America, in New York, at YIVO here, and in much of it ends up in Israel. So it's a story of this kind of spiritual heroism of Jews, risking their lives for their heritage, for their culture, and successfully passing it on to places where Jewish life can live freely. So that's the book in a nutshell.
What is the name of the book again?
It's called The Book Smugglers.
I've got postcards. It's sort of the literary version of the Monument.
Yeah, it's or the Jewish version.
The Jewish version of
mine.
the Monument Men. It was a movie that was out
Right.
several years ago. So I want to thank Dr. Fishman.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question.